Hi, I'm Niall O'Carroll, and this is Inertia Creeps. Hey man, how you doing?
I'm good. How are things? How you doing?
Not so bad, not so bad. It's a bit chilly here at the moment. I'm assuming you're back in base in Spain, are you?
Yeah, it's nice and warm over here at the moment. Although saying that, there's a little bit of rain in the air, so which is unusual, but yeah, quite nice.
Yeah, I think it's -3 or something here today. So yeah. I've got I've got my hot water bottle behind my back here to keep my old bones warmed up because struggling with back injuries and all sorts of things at the moment. How's the coaching prep going? You're planning what's the next competition you're headed for?
Yeah, good. No, all going well. I'm not in Australia this year, but supporting the player I coach, Tamara Zidanšek from afar. All going good. We actually leave. We leave for Thailand. Well, I'll meet her in Thailand over the next few days. We have an event in Thailand, and we have one in Mumbai in India the following week. But yeah, all going well. Start of the year, it's always tricky. Trying to find your feet, both physically and mentally a little bit. And yeah, just seeing where you're at. I think we obviously have the pre-season training in kind of November, December time, which is always a great chance to reset and refocus and kind of set some new goals. But obviously the flip side of that is you're a little bit out of match practice, even though you physically and mentally feel pretty fit. So it naturally takes a bit more time to just find where you're at and see how the work in pre-season has taken effect or not. So yeah, Thailand and India is up the two up next.
Cool. And I suppose it kind of leads us into an interesting conversation. And before we go there, I should probably let you introduce yourselves to the listeners. Tell us a little bit about Mike Digby and how you've come to be a coach on the ATP tour.
Yeah, no. Where do I start? Well, I mean, I think like any aspiring athlete, and I won't just put it into a bracket of tennis players. I started playing many sports when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, and that just happened to be a lot of racket sports. I kind of fell in love with my racket sports when I was much younger, and I think when I was maybe about 10 or 11, tennis took quite a big influence over my life and was something that I really really liked. And I think I ended up being okay as a junior. Started maybe a little bit later than most, but I always felt maybe starting later was a bit fresher. I was fresher. I kind of had that desire and want a little bit later in my kind of teenage years. So yeah, I started to properly compete when I was 14, 15. That then led into the conversations around college tennis, which now is for those listeners that don't know, US college, and for sport is arguably some of the biggest teams in the world are actually college teams. Um, and yeah, I ended up playing college tennis at Davenport University in Michigan between the ages of 18 and 22, and had aspirations to try and play professionally after that. But I think I realized, not necessarily quickly, but I realized that maybe my playing level was a little bit more limited than I originally thought, given that I started a bit later, didn't have that exposure to tennis when I was younger, where sometimes you can really develop those fundamental kind of learnings and behaviors. And I'm not just talking necessarily skill based in the sport, but also from a mentality standpoint, from an athletic standpoint, from a in the physical area. So um, that kind of led me down the route of being a hitting partner. Now, if you asked me what a hitting partner was when I was 16, 17, I would have no idea. But I actually ended up getting quite, well, I would say badly injured, but I had an injury when I was about 19, and I ended up coming back through practicing with lots of players at Wimbledon, through just getting a lot of practice hours in, and yeah, so I was introduced to the guy that runs the practice desk at Wimbledon, um, and from there I practiced with the likes of Novak Djokovic, Simona Halep. I practiced with Daniil Medvedev. I practiced with Naomi Osaka. A lot of big names, and I kind of had an inkling back then that I think maybe one of my strengths was my ability to connect with people, and to kind of not necessarily make them feel comfortable, but get the best out of them through me being hopefully myself, and cultivating a positive environment to allow them to perform. And I remember a few coaches that I was kind of around when I was a hitting partner often said, "Oh, would you ever consider going into the coaching route?" And it's something that kind of came into I guess, the forefront of my mind when I realized that maybe the playing route wasn't going to be as long as I thought it might be. And then from there, I ended up being a hitting partner to multiple Grand Slam champions. And that naturally led into being more of a coach, kind of in the high performing junior department on the ITF juniors with an Australian girl for a number of years. And then now I'm coaching Tamara Zidanšek, like I said, Slovenian player, and also helping out through the academy I'm at in Spain with Gabi Dabrowski, who's top 10 doubles player. So yeah, I think it kind of all came about through, I guess, the injury, really. That kind of kickstarted that process, which I think is quite ironic. But I also think a lot of setbacks lead to some amazing opportunities after.
Oh, completely, yeah. And actually, it's a great place to start the chat, really, is that kind of, it's often unforeseen circumstances that take us in a direction we don't particularly want to go. But the key element of it is I suppose it's your perspective, your mindset in relation to to what you do. There's that great line I always use that I think it's Aldous Huxley that says, "Experience isn't what happens to you; it's what you do with what happens to you." And how does it like when you're playing like NCAA? Standard is so high. You're mapping out at the time at 19 a potentially professional career, or figuring out where your career is in tennis. And then injury takes kind of a decision for you, and you're now helping other players develop, whether it's as a hitting partner or now as a coach. From an ego point of view, how did you kind of park the disappointment of your own personal ambitions as a player, and then try to channel that into what I mean? You name some of the best players in the world there, and I happen to know for a fact that you've warmed up players in preparation for Wimbledon finals and stuff like that. We'll talk about that later. But how do you channel your enthusiasm and love of the game into satisfying what you need to deliver for those players, when it's not about you anymore, it's about you delivering for them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually something that when I kind of realized that I wasn't going to play, that navigating that path of, I think, slowly shifting the mindset from, I'm looking to be a high performer myself, but I'm looking to be a high performer to then breed high performance in others. And I think that shift in mindset was actually quite natural for me, and it's not something that I necessarily thought about too much. I think sometimes things that are forced, it's less natural, less fluid. So I think because I always kind of kept my standards quite high, as a player, I think I tried to portray that off to the people that I was also helping and working with. So for me, I found it easy. I don't want to say it was easy, but I found it quite natural to be able to offload some of the things that I was doing onto others, because I think cultivating a high performance environment does come from the people that you surround yourself with. I'm a massive believer that you're the product of your environment, both from a positive angle and also from a negative aspect as well. I think for me, I got a lot of pleasure out of seeing others succeed through hopefully the help of the environment I was creating, whether that was in a hitting partner perspective or whether that was in a coaching perspective, because I think that knowing the person and or the people that you're working with is almost has a stronger impact than almost having the knowledge of being able to develop them, in my case, as a tennis player. Obviously that massively helps and is what you're judged by as in my profession, but I don't get the buy-in from the players that I coach if I don't know the person first. So, and I think that was something that I learned very quickly and allowed me to almost park my ego to one side, to then realize, well, actually, you know what? In a way, my ego is satisfied if I feel like that I've helped someone achieve their dreams, which I think is a different mindset to being a player, because naturally, as you will know, like, athletes are pretty selfish, and rightly so. You kind of have to be, especially in more of an individual based sport like tennis. Whereas the coach has to be quite selfless. But also I stressed this a minute ago, but I really do believe if the coach has a high performance mindset, then that will naturally, over time, start to shift onto the player. So, it was a relatively straightforward transition for me, actually, and I think that became easier when I accepted in my mind that I wasn't going to be playing for that long, and that I think when I accepted that, I'm not at the level to be able to play to the level that I thought I could, and I was honest with myself with those conversations, I think there's a natural mindset shift straight away anyway, that then the next thing that you do and the path that you take in your career, for me, was based around what I wanted to do with other people. I think that helped massively shift that across. Whereas I think maybe if it was almost the if buts and maybes, if I didn't get injured, that I still could have actually played to a high level, maybe that transition would have taken a little bit longer, because I'm still basing my decisions on what I'm doing with others on my ego, as opposed to actually, I genuinely want to try and develop this person because I want to get the best out of them for them. So, yeah, it was an interesting transition.
Yeah, and it is, and I want to ask you some questions about kind of that high performance mindset. And it is interesting that, you see it in tennis, you see it in most sports, that you don't have to be the highest performing player to be the highest performing coach. In fact, you look at the history of tennis, and you even look at the relatively recent history of tennis, and you've got people like Nick Bollettieri and Patrick Mouratoglou and these kind of guys who've done phenomenal work in tennis, who weren't the highest level of tennis player, but can deliver as coach. Now you have the Amelie Mauresmos and the Stefan Edbergs and Boris Beckers and all these guys who are absolute legends of the sport, who are coaches as well. But it is interesting, isn't it, that the ability to channel and nurture that kind of high performance mindset in someone doesn't have to come from your own experience of being there. And I find that, like, and obviously when I do these conversations, I try to relate everything back to the corporate world or even our personal lives. But we sometimes we hold ourselves back with this fear of, I can't do something, or I haven't done this, so I can't tell somebody else. But actually, if you have the skill set as a coach, it's a very, very different skill set to the skill set as an athlete, and nurturing those talents and the ability to nurture those talents in others is kind of the key thing that I differentiates the top coaches from the rest, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that one thing that has helped me I'm still very young, and a lot of people at my age would still be playing professional tennis. I know, I know. Yeah, so lucky. But I think the one thing that really, really helped me, the more I started to coach as well, was almost viewing the situation less about the level of player I was coaching, and more about how can I get the best out of the person. Because I think then naturally, if I don't know, I mean, let's take someone like a Tamara is been as high as 24, 22 in the world. She's made semi-finals of Grand Slams. She's, had an amazing career already. I view Tamara as someone that I want to try and get better in every aspect of her career, both on the court, habits off the court, that we can all develop, and I don't treat that any differently to try and improve the Australian junior that I was working with at the time. So I'm trying to improve individuals. That's my number one thing. And then within that, I'll then hopefully add the tennis element to it when we're on the court. So I think that for me is the number one priority, and that then naturally reduces, I guess, the nerves and the anxiety of working with high profile tennis players, whether it's in a junior perspective or more of a professional environment. It's about creating that high performing environment for them to then flourish and hopefully then ultimately at the end of the day improve as people and as tennis players.
And it part of a high performance mindset is the ability to deliver your best when things off the court aren't quite where they need to be. And that's a big challenge. And it's something that, it's quite often forgotten. And it's something I've discovered in my career, but it's something that's very often forgotten, is that you're dealing with human beings who have extraordinary talent in a certain area, but they're people and they have the same issues, the same family issues, the same relationship issues, sometimes the same money issues that the rest of us have. And yet they have to turn up and deliver this level of performance on a regular basis. So when you're dealing with that, and I mean, you hear the words resilience and focus and, and toughness and all these kind of words related to the mind kind of bandied about. But for you, working with a player, where do you kind of start with I suppose part of it is channeling because usually when a player comes to work with a coach, they're coming with baggage of something that's happened with a previous coach.
Yeah.
So you've got to park that and get them thinking about what's next and what they need to do. And we'll talk about habit formation in a minute. But where do you kind of begin with a player in trying to help them develop focus, resilience, mental toughness, whatever it is that needs to be developed, in order for them to be the best version of themselves more consistently?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is throwing the question back to them and going, what do they feel like they need in order to perform in a high stress environment more often? I think that's what I always like to find out, what they think they need, because you get a really good indication as to where their mind is at straight away from that initial question. And I try and then distinguish the performance values and the outcomes that they want. So, for example, it might be that, I don't know, that they want to be winning a Grand Slam in 2 years' time. That would be one of those outcomes. But the performance value is they want to try and find a stronger routine when they're under pressure. So once I know the information that they want, then I can then guide them and lead them through that process, through basically my experiences when I played a little bit, even though I didn't play to a high level. I know the sport. I played to a relatively high level, and also my experiences from being surrounded by, some of the best players in the world. You pick up those habits that they have. You pick up things that they might do that you can then try and influence. And then also adding, I guess, my values on top of that. So I think it's so important for the way I work that I understand what they want first, because I think one of the most common mistakes, and I've certainly been guilty of doing it in my young career, is almost a player comes to you and wants to work with you, and then before you even ask them what they want, you kind of just go, right, well, you need to do this, and this. Whereas actually what we need to do is ultimately every player and personality is different. So we as coaches and high performing people as well need to try and find ways and adapt the way that we work in order to cater for the player whilst not losing our personalized touch. So I guess the number one thing is asking them, what do they need? Whether that's from a physical, technical, tactical, mental standpoint, and then steering them towards the values that I have and the standards that I set to try and influence them on the way that they practice day to day. So I'm a big believer, and I know you mentioned that we're going to go into more like habits and how they're formed and created, but I'm a massive believer that routines day to day add so much value and also reduce the heightened emotions. So you're always going to feel emotion. if you wake up in the morning, you have no idea whether you're going to be happy, sad, got a headache, got a stomach ache, whatever it might be. But it's also about managing those emotions, not trying to control them. Because I think as soon as you try and control an emotion, the emotion will get heightened and heightened and heightened and heightened, because that's what breeds frustration. So I try and go down the path of managing players through managing their emotions. You're never going to get rid of it. It's normal to have anxieties, to have nerves, to have stresses, and have these kind of feelings when you're playing. But what are we going to do to manage them so then that when you do compete under a lot of pressure, under a lot of stress in front of thousands of people, how are we going to manage those so that they don't then affect the decision making and execution of what you're trying to do? And that's where, for me, routines come in. And I think the routine then breeds the habit. So as an amazing quote that really resonated with me, that I can't remember who it was by, but I think I was watching a video or something, and it was a habit missed once is a mistake, and a habit missed twice is the start of a new habit. So I really it really resonated with me, because it's so true. And that's where your routines come in. So every morning we all brush our teeth, regardless of whether we feel terrible, good, bad. You spend 2-3 minutes, you brush your teeth, just like every evening. So we've taken the emotional stress out of doing it, because that's just become a routine, and now it's become a habit through doing the routine. So I have the same with players. There's going to be pre-point and mid-point routines that you're going to do, and it might be, to name some really basic ones, you look at your strings, or you go to your towel. You'll see a lot of players go to their towel. That routine of doing that over and over again keeps the mind in the present moment more often than not, and doesn't allow it to drift into the past or into the future. So if that's the case, then routines will then be able to form these habits that we ultimately want. So then a routine and an emotion that come up, so let's say, for example, I'm feeling really nervous. Well, if I know that my routine, regardless of how I feel, is going to the towel, that's the way I cope. I'm going to use my coping mechanism by going to the towel. Complete a present moment activity to get yourself then back in the headspace to then play the next point. So that's how I try and, I guess, I try and manage emotions and manage stress levels. And I'll never use the word of take away or control, because I think if you try and take away an emotion, you're only ever going to be fighting a losing battle. And I think that's the way it hopefully helps players to play a little bit better under pressure.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? And it's something, like, obviously you and I have spoken about this before, but it's something that I'm very passionate about, is the idea of staying present, and any tool or any habit that can help you to stay present and not get caught up in all the things you've no control over. It's a very foreign concept for people to understand, that you don't control the outcome of a match by what you do, but you influence it. You don't control
completely
what your opponent is doing, but you influence what your opponent is doing by where you position the ball and all those kind of things. And again, some players, you might give them a softball because they like to hit it for really, really hard, and others you might want to put a lot of spin on the ball. You might bring it short and then take it long, and there's just, you're influencing their movement and how they're returning the ball to you by what you do. But it's so rare for players, especially when the pressure comes on. Like when you see people kind of, and I hate the term choking, but when you see pressure start to have an impact on somebody, especially in a Grand Slam, it's usually because their mind is racing ahead to what's going to happen. And it's not taken care of. Like for a tennis player, the only thing you have control over in the moment is your racket making contact with the ball. That's like you can, like just say, for example, returning a serve, you have very little, it's fascinating to watch, but you have very little control unless you're an extraordinarily talented player. You have very little control over what happens in the return of serve. Quite often it's just about getting the racket on the ball, right? But then it's about what you do in the next step and the next step. So.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting. There's a few thoughts that go into mind there. I think just before I touch on to kind of like the sport itself, but I'm a big believer as well when we speak about influencing, outcomes. We can influence outcomes through the aura we have massively. And you can absolutely, in tennis, I talk a lot about you can win points without even playing a point. And I think Rafa Nadal is possibly one of the greatest that has ever done this on the men's side. And I would argue that Serena Williams is the greatest that's ever done it on the women's side, because their aura and presence that they create after playing a particular point can lead to errors from the opponent 2-3 points in a row going into it through the pure intimidation factor. I've seen multiple players when they've been drawn against Nadal in the locker room, the heads just drop. And it's like, it's that aura and presence that individual creates, I think, also influences the outcome more often than not because of it, which is really, really interesting. But going back to kind of the reactive side of it, and return of serve is a great example. I think tennis and a lot of racket sports they're reaction-based sports. It's constantly being influenced by what's happening on the other side of the net. So it's a challenging sport to sometimes teach, because you've got to be able to be quite subjective at times, and it's also a lot about perception and anticipation. They're vital to be a high performing tennis player. Your ability to anticipate and perceive what's happening. And I kind of break those down into technical, tactical, and geometrical. So technical anticipation would be based around what you see from the other person. So, for example, if you're hitting a forehand and approaching the net, well, you might approach the net if you see that the other person's back is facing you because they're under pressure and they're on the stretch. Tactical anticipation would be about kind of probability around knowing your opponent. So it might be that I know that the opponent I play absolutely loves his backhand down the line. So I'm going to try and play in a way that I'm not going to give him that particular shot. Or if I do, I can tactically anticipate that this might be what happens. And then geometrical is about the conditions. So if it's incredibly windy in one side, I can anticipate what might happen when I'm perceiving the ball, whether the wind's blowing into me or away from me. So it's such a reactive sport, and you have to be so good at being able to kind of react well to then be proactive on your side of the court when you can. So it's not that I'm heavily involved in the sport, but I think it's one of the most challenging sports to play to a high level, because there's so many components that you have to be really good at. It's really, really challenging. And that's not me saying that other sports aren't, because they're all incredibly tough to be a real high profile athlete. But I've definitely seen so many components in tennis, and seen so many players that are amazing at certain components but struggle with one and then really struggle to break through. So yeah, it's a really interesting concept.
When you're with your coaching hat on, when you're a hitting partner, and I know you were a hitting partner for a player ahead of the Wimbledon final last year.
Yes.
Which must have been a very cool experience. But when you're kind of hitting with someone, like getting them warmed up before they go out to perform, and you've got your coaching hat on, what do you learn from those experiences, and in particular that experience of the sheer enormity and the pressure of a Wimbledon final?
Yeah, so I warmed up on Jabeur, who played in the Wimbledon final last year, actually on centre court, which in itself, take away everything, was an incredible experience for me. Like, I've been going to watch Wimbledon since I was 11, 12 years old. So, to be able, and when I'm going, I'm dreaming of even stepping on centre court. So to then go and be able to warm up a Wimbledon finalist, as an experience standpoint, was incredible. But I think a lot of the warm-ups and practices during a Grand Slam, there's not necessarily loads you're going to learn from a tactical standpoint, because it's very much the latter stages of preparation. So a lot of the preparation has been done quite a few weeks before. But from a psychological standpoint, you can obviously pick up certain traits and see which types of players are maybe more comfortable in their environment through, the way they act, the way they're communicating with the people around them. But I think for me, what because I'm now coaching kind of, mainly, I actually have started to analyze how the coaches are in those environments. And I think the best coaches that I've seen in those environments in the latter stages of the Grand Slams, again, they've got this very high performance mindset of trying to keep the athlete in a headspace to be able to perform at their best. But regardless of whether someone's playing in, a first round or a final, we go back to the habits and routines. They're all the same. There's no difference. So the player then doesn't feel like that the magnitude of the occasion is also getting to the coach. There's nothing worse than not that I've experienced this, but I can imagine there's nothing worse than being a player in a semi-final, final of a Grand Slam, and you also know that your coach knows that you're in the semi-final and final of a Grand Slam, and he or she is just really stressed, really nervous, because all that environment, which goes back to my whole philosophy around you're the product of your environment, that environment will naturally have an impact on the player. So I learned these bits. I learned kind of the little tricks of the trade around how to cultivate those environments under high stress, how to manage the crowd, how to manage the occasion. Really small things. I know it's crazy, but when I'm at a Grand Slam, I'll always go pick up the practice balls for the player, so the player doesn't have to worry about going around big busy spaces. I'll make sure that I hand the rackets in. I'll get the waters, because when you're wanting to try and get in a headspace, and we won't beat around the bush, there's hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars on the line when you're competing. You don't want to be around others that are also probably feeling those other stresses. So being able to gauge the mood of the player is huge, which it goes back to being able to read the person and try and help them manage their emotions. So if they feel like they need some more interaction, or they're a little bit, then I might bring a family member to come and have dinner, or it might be that, I don't know, that I know that the hitting partner that we're using the night before had just found out that, I don't know, that he didn't get a job that he was applying for. So I might not then bring them in the following morning, because I might know that might affect the way they are on the court, which is going to then affect the environment that I'm looking to cultivate as a coach. So all of these kind of little things.
There's a huge amount of considerations for a coach, isn't there?
A huge amount of considerations, and all of those little kind of decisions that you make day to day have a massive impact ultimately when the player steps on the court. And it's realizing that, because often we just think, the hitting partner's in a bad mood. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's got nothing to do with us. Well, it has got a lot to do with us, because if that person then maybe, the player I'm working with is feeling that, then that's only ever going to affect them in a way that's going to be an environment I don't want on the court for them. So it's a real balance sometimes, and I think there's a switch as well with when you're working with juniors, because I think, and I'm not saying that professional players can't learn. We can all learn, we can all develop, and we can all get better. But when you're working with a junior and you're maybe trying to shape the mentality a little bit more, and there's more, you can be a bit more malleable with that, then maybe there's sometimes where, if, as it would take the hitting partner example, I'm making it up, but they come in and they're in a bad mood, it's like, okay, well, let's try and deal with it. How are we going to learn from this occasion? How are you going to be able to manage your emotions, even though someone down the other side isn't really wanting to practice? So there's a different mentality shift, I think, maybe when you're working with younger players, because it's about teaching and educating as much as it is making them feel good when they step on the match court. So
yeah, absolutely. And I just want to actually question for you, and I certainly don't mean this in any way as seeking some sort of criticism of your fellow professionals, but more like the experience you had, like from the outside watching, right? So I'm a big tennis fan. So I was watching Wimbledon last year, and I was watching Ons, who was phenomenal throughout that tournament. And the thing that was really noticeable to me on final day was the pressure she was under, because she was the first. She had the potential to be the first person from her continent to win a Wimbledon title. And, there was all sorts of dignitaries from her country there, and there was all sorts of media coverage, and BBC had done this big narrative around this thing. So obviously she's talking about this all week, and there's a lot of pressure on her. For you, and this is in no way asking you now to put yourself into a position where you criticize her coach or her manager, backroom team, or anything like that. But for you, in the middle of that environment and the weight of pressure that was on a player, even ignoring the pressure that was on it just to play in Wimbledon, did you take anything away from that, from the point of view of your mindset about how you're going to help your players deal with challenges and pressure, and I suppose going back to the routines and all the kind of things you talked about earlier? But did you take anything from that? Because that is about as pressurized. I mean, a Wimbledon final is about as pressurized you're going to get for a tennis player, right?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I learned a lot through, because I was in Ons's, or just behind Ons's box for that match. So I watched it live, and learned a hell of a lot just through being there, just through being there, watching the box, the team, both players, which was fascinating. But I think it goes back to, I know I've said it a lot, but routines and habits. I'm a massive believer that if routines are changed in high stress environments, then I think it's naturally going to have a negative impact on how you deal with certain situations under high levels of stress. And I think that was maybe one of the challenges that both players faced in Vondrousova and Jabeur, because to play in a Wimbledon final, the press and the media coverage almost ramps up in the space of, or by the time you've won your semi-final, before you're about to play the final. So being able to manage that and being able to get yourself in a headspace to understand that almost your next 24 hours changes even more than it did being in a semi-final, through the amount of press and engagement that you're going to get in and around not only Wimbledon, but in London, which is one of the biggest cities, the most well-known cities in the world. And on top of that, like you said, Ons being the first player from our continent to try and win a Wimbledon title, you've got to be able to try and get the balance between embracing that moment as much as possible, but not losing the routines that you've had throughout the entire tournament. And I'm not just talking about the routines on the court. There might be certain times you eat in the day. There might be certain times you do the match prep in the day. It might be the places you go to dinner. It might be the conversations that you're looking to cultivate as a high performing team before the match, and getting that balance of locking herself into playing ultimately another tennis match, but also embracing the moment of being in her third Grand Slam final, which in itself is an incredible achievement. You know, there's not many tennis players, both male or female, that can say they've made 3 Grand Slam finals. So I think, routines, it's huge. But it's also normal, even though with the routines you use to, also the emotions are going to be much higher. You're going to feel the emotions even stronger than maybe you would do anyway. But there's loads that I took out of it. Some of the stuff that I won't share, just because it's maybe a bit more private towards Ons herself, and her team. But I think a lot of the stuff, and a lot of the team that were with Ons, and I guess me, for those few days leading up to it, would have absolutely reflected and analysed what they could have done better. And I think that's the sign of a real high performing coach is okay, yes, okay, my player ultimately was the one playing the match and they were the one that lost or won the final. But that shouldn't reflect always on how I did my job as a coach, because actually it might be that she lost, but I felt like everything in my power I did to give her the best possible chance to succeed. Or it might be the conversations you have with yourself around, right, you know what, if we were in this situation again, then I'm going to change that and do that a little bit differently. And it's your job then as a coach to go away and then maybe seek advice from others that have got over the winning line as a coach to help their player. What did they do? What helped them? So it goes back to the original conversation we started having around a high performance environment isn't just the player performing at a high level. It's the coaches cultivating that in and around that player, which is going to allow them to play at a higher level more consistently over a longer period of time.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? So, from your perspective, I suppose you've got a fairly busy schedule this season, and maybe tell me a little bit. Actually, I'm very conscious of time, so I won't take up too much more of your time. But tell me a little bit about the process for a player to something that a lot of people don't understand is how do players qualify for Grand Slams, and how, as a coach, then your calendar can shift depending on what tournaments you're playing in.
Yeah, I mean, at a Grand Slam, you have obviously the main draw, which is the 128 players that play in that tournament, and that is full of seeded players that aren't seeded but have a high enough ranking to get direct acceptance into the draw. Wild cards, so different nations will have different maybe upcoming players from their country or from neighbouring countries that offer wild cards, and also players that qualify for the main draw. So you then have, before that, the qualifying is 3 rounds. So you have to win 3 matches to be able to get and be accepted, basically, and qualify for the main draw of a Grand Slam, which is what we always see on TV and, on the big stadium courts as an example. But then even before that, you have pre-qualifying, which is a lot of the time, and I'll take Wimbledon for an example. Pre-qualifying will be for British players, where they can enter a pre-qualifying draw to get into qualifying for Wimbledon. So there's actually, you could end up having to win, I might be wrong here, but 6 or 7 matches until you actually get into the main draw, which is where the likes of Djokovic, the Federers, Nadal, Serena Williams, Simona Halep, that's where they start, because they're high enough ranking to be able to get in and be seeded at these events. So it's rigorous, and then you've also then got the whole dilemma where if your ranking is kind of on the cusp of qualifying but main draw, the last minute you could shift into the main draw, which then has a massive impact on the schedule leading up to that, sometimes weeks before that, and definitely days. So you'll hit a certain ranking on the tour, which is, I'd probably say, around 40, 50, 60 in the world, where you'll be direct acceptance into every high level event in the main draw. And that's Grand Slams, that's Masters Series, that's just below the Masters Series, and you can kind of go on. If you're 80 to 100 in the world, then you're most likely going to be in the main draw of Grand Slams because it's a bigger draw, but you're always running the risk of maybe not in the tournaments on the ATP or WTA calendar that is the highest caliber of tournaments outside the Grand Slams. You're most likely going to be qualifying. And there's not many sports in the world where you're top 100 at what you do, yet you're having to play in the qualifying to get into the actual main event. If you're the 80th best footballer in the world, you're probably competing for the biggest titles in the world, earning the most money, playing for the biggest teams. So it's and I'm using football as an example. It's a rigorous process, and your ranking influences a lot on what you play.
It sure does, yeah, and hence the trips to Thailand and
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, Tamara's in a position where she can play the big events, but some of them, depending on who enters, she might be one of the top seeds in qualifying. So Thailand is a lower end tournament on the WTA tour, but still, if you were to look at the entry list, it's still a very high caliber event because everyone's fighting for matches, for spots, for ranking points, and their ability to ultimately push themselves up the rankings to play consistently in these Grand Slams.
Final question for you, and I love this stuff. I think it's fascinating, and I think we get caught up sometimes looking at the very, very top of the sport, and we forget what's going on, underneath. But for you, I suppose, for yourself and as a coach and as a leader, how do you channel the the pressure and the stress of what you want for your player,
Mm.
but insulate them and give them the best opportunity of being successful. So I suppose going back to what you spoke about at Wimbledon is like that thing about how do you internalize all the normal emotions you're going to feel, and as you're kind of figuring out what Grand Slams you're going to play in or what tournaments you're going to play in and all those kind of things, there's a lot of pressure on you as a coach. But how do you internalize that to deliver, or what is the message, or how do you kind of manage all that so that you ensure that your player is getting the best possible support from you they can get?
As in my emotions, or managing the player's emotions?
Well, I suppose a little bit of both, because your emotions are going to influence the player's emotions, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think if I start with I'm a competitor. First and foremost, I love competing. And I think most high performing people want to be the best at what they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be high performing. So naturally, I'm going to feel these emotions. When I'm sitting on the sideline and there's, hundreds of thousands of people watching, and I'm working with someone and I'm invested in someone's journey, my competitor comes out naturally. So it's a little bit of that chimp inside me. I've got to manage really, really well in order for the player to not feel the emotions that isn't going to help them, but feel the emotion for me that will. And that's different with every player. So I think me being able to, and I reflect a lot. I do a lot of like weekly reflections and try and develop myself as a human being and also as a coach, and try and kind of write down certain things which I feel like I've done well and certain things that I could develop and get better at, both weekly, monthly, and then yearly. That helps me because then I become more aware of what I need to get better at. And if I'm aware of it, then it makes it much easier for me to manage my emotions when doing it, which then naturally in turn will help develop the player because I'm giving the best version of myself. But for a player, I said this at the start, and I'll probably say it for a long, long time. If you know the person that you're working with and you know their habits, you know their traits, you know what routines they need and that they like in order to develop, you'll pick up tendencies, both verbal and non-verbal, that will allow you to make decisions to help them get the best out of them in those high stress environments. And those in our sport, in tennis, are Grand Slams. That's what players build up for. So I think the non-verbal and the verbal cues are huge when you coach athletes. But in order for you to spot them, you need to know the person first. You need to know when they communicate to you. Can you gauge maybe how they're feeling? Do I know Tamara will give me certain cues, and players that I've worked with in the past will give me certain cues that, because I know them, that gives me a good idea as to how they've responded and reacted to that particular situation. So then I can take action accordingly. So I just think it's connection. Like, get to know your athlete, whether that's going for coffee with them and asking how their brothers and sisters are doing, whether that's asking how their dog is, whether that's, asking how the parents are, or whatever that might be. That naturally brings that human touch and connection that you want for them to then break down those barriers. And we speak about baggage with ex-coaches or with physios, fitness coaches. You need to be able to get to a position where they feel comfortable letting you in and discussing that, so then you get enough information to try and develop them as human beings as well as tennis players.
Fantastic. Mike, absolute pleasure chatting to you, my friend.
You're more than welcome. Was really good.
Always a joy. I shall talk to you soon. Take care.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.